imagination, fancy, esemplastic, willing suspension of disbelief. They sound like loaded terms, things which belong to the world of academia. But sometimes these words define the core of where a friendship went wrong. A friendship between two most amazing poets of the Romantic period, whose estrangement was strangely rooted in the way they looked at poetry. So while we have seen what Wordsworth looks like when he writes about poetry, it's time for us to explore the most important concepts that we have in Coleridge's The Biographia Literaria is a critical autobiography by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It was published in 1817 in two volumes. In fact, the working title was Autobiographia Literaria. The problem with the book that the students have is that it is not structured very methodically, neither is it an autobiography. It is more like a collection of Coleridge's opinions and more like a reaction to the way Wordsworth presented his theories in the preface. Taking structurally, the Biographia Literaria can be divided into loosely four sections. The first four chapters essentially deal with Coleridge's early life up to his collaboration with Wordsworth on the lyrical ballads. So here we have details about his school education and early learning. From chapter 5 to chapter 13, what we can call the philosophical chapters, we have a very condensed idea about Coleridge's development of philosophy or his reaction to materialism, concepts like associationism, and all that. This section happens to be the most inaccessible section so far as students are concerned. However, the section which is most interesting for a student of literature happens to be the one which comes right after this. That is chapters 14 to chapter 22. Here he engages with practical criticism, and this is the section where we get to understand most of his concepts in relation to poetry, imagination, creativity. He deals with not just the poems by Wordsworth in the lyrical ballads, but also he deals with poets such as Shakespeare, Donne, Pindar, and so on. And this is the section where we get to see where and how he differed from Wordsworth. The final section, that is chapter 23 and 24, they are mostly Satyraine's letters, and these may be seen as a continuation of chapter 22. Here he mostly deals with contemporary literature, such as those by Klopstock, Maturin, and contemporary reviews, and his take on certain moral, political, aesthetic issues. Our focus then is going to be the section which essentially deals with poetry and creativity. However, as I had already told you, Coleridge had not written Biographia Literaria as a very systematic book. So automatically, some of the concepts which we will have to understand from section 3 are mentioned even in the previous sections. So we have to understand how his thought developed over time, and to some extent his idea and to some extent Coleridge's philosophy has to be approached in order to understand his idea on literature. Whenever we talk about Coleridge's theory of poetry, fancy and imagination happen to be two words which are always brought in focus. He mentions these words quite early in his book in chapter 4 itself. And he writes, "Fancy and imagination were two distinct and widely different faculties instead of being, according to the general belief, either two names with one meaning or at furthest the lower and higher degree of one and the same power. So he, at the very beginning, establishes or tries to establish that fancy and imagination are two different things. And why is he doing this? Because Wordsworth, in his preface, had loosely used the term fancy alongside the term imagination, giving this idea that both are very similar to each other. And this is where Coleridge says that the problem arises because fancy and imagination are completely different things. He criticizes Wordsworth by saying the explanation which Mr. Wordsworth has given himself, notice the coldness in the way he's addressing Mr. Wordsworth, will be found to differ from mine, chiefly perhaps as our objects are different. So we are looking at poetry differently, we are looking at creativity differently, so our explanation is going to be different. Now, in order to understand this difference, we need to have a little idea about how he looked at contemporary philosophy. Now, what were the philosophers bothered about during his time? Philosophers in general are bothered about how knowledge is gained by human beings, and they call it this branch of how we know about the reality as epistemology. In chapter 5, he directly talks about the idea of associationism. Now, the idea of association, it was thought even by Aristotle. What is association? Suppose you have an experience in life and later on a very similar thing is happening to you. So you will recall, you will remember what exactly happened in the first time, and you will remember certain things which are not present in the next moment. So this is how you associate, right? And you connect, and this is how memory is formed. And Aristotle said that time, space, causality, similarity or contrast, all these things are responsible in the way you associate things. For instance, your mother cooks a certain dish and it has a very specific smell, and much later when you are away from your mother, you suddenly have that dish served to you. That smell will bring back your mother's image in front of you, although your mother is not present there. Why? Because in your brain you have associated that smell with your mother's face. So this is how we understand association or associationism as a part of knowledge gaining or remembering or memory. Now, during the time of Coleridge, when you look at the philosophers like Hobbes, for instance, he said that this is a merely physical phenomenon. So it's like your brain is working in a mechanical way, all right, by connecting the neurons, making connections and all that. Descartes introduced a more complex view of association. And now with Cartesian philosophy, I have mentioned this even in Wordsworth's class, we have this idea that there is the body and there is the soul. And knowledge involves some kind of connection between the two. And Descartes was quite fascinated with the idea of association, and he even said that it is possible to have sensation even without the body. And he gave this idea of phantom limb, where somebody's leg is cut off and he still feels the pain because that wound is associated with pain in his mind. And even when the wounded leg is separated from the body, even then the pain is felt because it is through association. It was Hartley who introduced the idea of intellect in this mix, and he tried to approach the gap in Cartesian philosophy, because in Cartesian philosophy the two entities, the body and the soul, they were conceived as separate identities, and it was not explained very clearly how they merged into one another. That is, how your sensations of the body are transferred to your mind, to your soul. All right. What Coleridge did is he traces the idea of associationism back to Ludovicus Vives, who also explored how thoughts could be linked together. Vives made a distinction between imaginatio and fantasia. What is imaginatio? Imaginatio is when you are having impressions of the world without being active. That is, the things that you perceive automatically. All right, that is imaginatio according to Ludovicus Vives. And fantasia means where you are actively trying to connect the impressions to form certain perceptions. So passive reception of impression is imaginatio, and active combination of impressions is fantasia. Coleridge said that this word imaginatio is directly connected to imagination and fantasia is connected to fancy. So since these two words are originating into different ideas, one is passive, one is active, therefore, or rather one is involuntary and another is voluntary, therefore you cannot say that the two are the same. In chapter 5, he will now give us further explanation of how association works in terms of imagination, in terms of fancy. He gives a very good example. He says, let us consider what we do when we leap. So when we are, say, jumping a step, then what we do? We first resist the gravitating power by an act of purely voluntary, and then by another act, voluntary in part, we yield to it in order to alight on the spot. So what he is saying, when we decide to jump or leap, it is a voluntary thing. Voluntary means something which we want to do, which is under our will. Okay, you decide to do it. So you decide to jump, and then you make the first movement against gravity. Still you are in control, right? You are deciding to do it. But then there is a moment when suddenly gravity takes control and things become more like involuntary. So the starting point of that leap is under your control, but where you will land is not always under your control. So that is partly involuntary. Then he goes on to say, now let a man watch his mind while he is composing. Now, when you're writing a poem, for example, or composing anything, you have to think carefully how you are doing it. And he says, or take a still more common case while he is trying to recollect a name. Sometimes it happens, now we want to recollect a name and we can't remember. Then what are we actually doing? There are evidently two powers at work, which relatively to each other are active and passive. And this is not possible without an intermediate faculty. There is a power in us which is intermediate to completely active and completely passive. So when you are recalling somebody's name, you are trying to think about something consciously, willingly, voluntarily, but then something happens, a click happens, and you suddenly remember, and that is out of your control, that is involuntary. So that means the power which you are using, it is neither completely active, voluntary, nor completely passive, involuntary, but an intermediary, you can say. And then he says, in philosophical language, we must denominate this intermediate faculty in all its degrees and determinations, the imagination. And he goes like all capitals. But in common language, especially on the subject of poetry, we appropriate the name to a superior degree of the faculty. Now, in case of poets, because they have heightened sensibility, therefore this power which in a normal human being helps that person to remember a name, to make associations, that same power in a poet works in a very stronger way, and that is imagination when you're talking about poetry. So there are two kinds of imagination, he's saying. One of the common man and one of the poet. And this will be elaborated much later. When we come down to chapter 8 and 9, we see that there is more philosophy. Till we reach chapter 10, where he suddenly makes use of a word, or rather a qualitative adjective, and it's called esemplastic. And then he explains that this word is not in the dictionary, as in this word is not in the dictionary written by Johnson. And he says The word is not in Johnson, nor have I met with it elsewhere. That means it's something he is creating. I constructed it myself from the Greek words eis en platein, to shape into one. Because, having to convey a new sense, I thought that a new term would both aid the recollection of my meaning. So he doesn't want us to confuse between what he thinks about imagination. So he gives us a new word which is called esemplastic. So does it mean that for Coleridge, esemplastic is imagination? No, he's saying let's not confuse. Esemplastic is a special power. What special power? The special power by which we can unite things into one. And what does he actually mean by that? You see, when a poet writes, or any author, what he or she does is that they collect the different experiences they have gathered over time, different ideas they have studied about, read in other poets and writers, and then they put together in one single unit. So they are unifying varied experiences, varied ideas, and bringing them together into one. Because they have what? They have esemplastic power. Although Coleridge has mentioned a Greek origin for his word, his word is more or less modeled on Schelling's idea of Einingsbildung, which means bringing together the opposites. What happens when you bring together opposites? Think about William Blake. You bring together opposites, the contrary elements, and then you form a unified whole. So the same idea is working in case of Coleridge. That when a writer writes, there is a power in the writer which helps him or her bring together all these different kinds of experiences, different kinds of ideas into one single idea. So that is the meaning of exemplar. And finally, when we reach chapter 13, we have the definition of fancy, imagination, all given in a very complicated manner. And there is a lot of anger too. You see, when Coleridge sent his working draft to his publisher containing all those chapters on philosophy, his publisher was not very enthusiastic. And he said that, see, there you have mentioned that you're going to write a book on philosophy. So I would suggest that whatever discussion on philosophy and complicated ideas of epistemology and these things you are doing, please continue that in the book on philosophy. And since this book is about literature, please focus on the concepts and topics and you define them. That is the response from the publisher. So Coleridge was quite furious about it. And he said that since my publisher has asked me to define things, I'm going to define things. And then he suddenly gives two stanzas where he doesn't explain anything, and we can see that he is totally frustrated with the way in which his previous chapters were received. And so he kind of gives us this dense definition which have baffled critics, students over time. So what does he actually say there? The end of chapter 13, and he does not give any kind of explanation to make things better for us. And he says, the imagination then I consider either as primary or secondary. Now, if you just look at this sentence, you will be totally confused. But since we have already seen what his idea is in chapter 4, and then his general take on the idea of association, and we have gone through that example of what happens when a person leaps, we are in a better position to understand his definition. We will understand that, okay, so he's trying to make a distinction between the imagination which is possessed by the common man and the imagination which is possessed by the poet. First one is primary, second one is secondary. And he explains, the primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception. This means that you don't have to be any special kind of a human being. If you are a sensible human being with your cognitive powers intact, you do not have any mental challenges, then you possess primary imagination. It is the primary power which is present in all of us. And as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Now, this is a very complicated construction. I am, you can translate it as the divine power which a human being may believe in. He does not define it as any particular religious idea of God, but in general, he says that there is this creative power. And it doesn't matter which religion you belong to. If you believe that there is a creator, if you believe that there is a power higher than what we see around us, then he calls that power the power of creativity, the infinite I am. And interestingly, it's like the expression Aham Brahmasmi. That is, I am Brahma. So it's like we are individuals and we are all part of that universal I. Okay? And what does this universal I do? This universal I creates the universe. What does the individual I do? Like you and me, we create our small universes. And they are just like in the same way the big universe is created. It's more like when you look at the solar system, you see planets going around the sun. And when you look into the micro world of electrons and protons, you see a very similar kind of a movement happening there. So it's like we are living in the microcosmic world and it's just kind of replica of the macrocosmic world. And therefore, whatever we are seeing in around us, whatever we are knowing about the world is like we are parts of that universal knowledge. Okay? So that is primary imagination. So primary imagination makes us look at a tree and see it as a tree because in universal consciousness, there is an idea of a tree which matches with my perception of that object. So again, see, it's somehow going towards Plato's ideas of form. Without Coleridge mentioning Plato, we can see how Plato looms large on him. And so whenever you are in doubt, think about Plato's idea. What did Plato say? That there is this world of forms, ideal forms. And where does this world exist? It doesn't exist in the tangible real world we see around us. Because it is the ideal world. It cannot be in the real world. So what you see as reality is a copy of that ideal form. So when you look at a tree, you understand that it is a tree because that object has a quality which matches with the ideal tree. And where is the ideal tree? In your mind, in the world of ideas. This is the same thing Coleridge is saying. That my perception is matching, is an echo of, or rather a copy of the universal perception or the ideal perception of the infinite I am. All right? Because if there is a world of forms, somebody must have imagined that also. And that entity is the infinite I am, the Godhead. So Coleridge refers to the primary imagination as the core mental ability that enables us to perceive the world. You don't have to be a poet to have primary imagination. It is a fundamental power in all of us. So when we use our primary imagination, we are doing exactly the same thing as the imagined creator is doing when he is creating the world. The secondary imagination, he says, I consider as an echo of the former, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still as identical with the primary in the kind of its agency and differing only in degree. So primary imagination and secondary imagination are made of the same stuff. But in case of secondary imagination, you have greater intensity, all right, where you can reach closer to this idea of the ideal world. So it is different in degree, not in kind, and in the mode of its operation. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. It dissolves what? You're seeing in front of you a tree, and you are looking at the tree and you are understanding that it's a tree. It's different from the background of the landscape. That is primary imagination. So in primary imagination, what you're doing, you're looking at different things that make up a tree: the leaves, the branches, the green color, and all these different things are brought together to form that shape in your mind, which is very similar to the way God creates tree. If you can just replace the word I am with God for the sake of simplicity. So that is primary imagination. But what if that tree you're looking at dissolves, disappears, diffuses, it kind of, the boundary melts, and you begin to see not just the tree, but something like the entire nature symbolized there. Or you see an entity speaking to you. So you are dissolving the existing reality, and then out of that dissolved state, something related is created. But are you doing it voluntarily? That is the trick. You're not doing it completely voluntarily. You're not saying to yourself that, look, I'm looking at a tree now and I'm going to look at it as a symbol now. Then that is voluntary. But if that automatically happens by some power which is lying very precariously close to both voluntary and involuntary, a fine balance, then that power is the power of the poet, where you are not just looking at things and making sense, you are recreating sense. And that is secondary imagination. And he says it dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. Or where this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events it struggles to idealize and to unify. Idealize, reaching that ideal state, the platonic world of the forms. You are looking at maybe a tree which is dried up in winter, but you can perceive its treeness. And in that treeness, that ideal form of the tree, there are no dried branches. It's always such a green, perfect thing. So you are dissolving that dry figure which is there in front of you, and you can visualize that ideal tree in that dried tree, because that is the exercise of the secondary imagination. Primary imagination will only let you see it as a dry tree. It is essentially vital, even as all objects are essentially fixed and dead. So objects are dead, fixed. If it's a dried tree, it's a dried tree, it's fixed. But your secondary imagination will look at it, and it may reach a different kind of a perception. So your secondary imagination is vital. It is living. That is the spirit which makes a deeper understanding of the world. Something which can look beyond the obvious or beyond the visible, perceivable reality. So it is not purely automatic or spontaneous. There is an element of your will to look at things differently. And then fancy, he says, on the contrary, has no other counters to play with but fixities and definite. Fancy is something totally under your command. How? You're looking at a tree and you decide to imagine that tree in a different circumstance. You decide. So that will lead to fancy. Okay? He says, the fancy is indeed no other than a mode of memory, emancipated from the order of time and space. What is memory? Memory is sum total of our experiences. For instance, what is your memory about your childhood home? For instance, it had a courtyard, all right, and it was in a village in India. Fine. And then you go to, say, England for studying. And there is Christmas, and you see people having these Christmas tree, real tree. In India, we have plastic Christmas trees because we don't have Christmas trees here growing all around us. So you see there people putting up actual Christmas trees in their living room, and then suddenly you decide to imagine that Christmas tree in your village in India, which is not a possibility because Christmas trees, they don't grow there naturally. So the point is, you are deliberately trying to fantasize something. So this is not imagination. This is not happening spontaneously. You're deciding to do it. And that is fancy. So what you are doing is you have decided to free your memory of your courtyard from the order of time and space, and you can think about a Christmas tree there, or a Christmas tree right in the middle of your bedroom. That is fanciful thinking. So it's a matter of choice. And he says so. He says, it is blended with and modified by that empirical phenomenon of the will which we express by the word choice. So fancy is a result of our decision to fantasize that. All right. So it is not spontaneous. But equally, with the ordinary memory, the fancy must receive all its materials ready-made from the law of association. But then, in order to have any kind of fantasy, all the components of that fancy, for instance, the Christmas tree, your courtyard, okay, the decorations on the tree, the images that are associated with your childhood, everything is already there. So what you're doing is you're picking and choosing things and putting them together like a jigsaw puzzle. So it's not that you are creating something new. The Christmas tree in your courtyard is not the ideal Christmas tree. It's still the same real thing in some other real circumstance. So that is fancy. So fancy in Coleridge's definition is far limited. It only works with fixities. You cannot create any new thing. You can only join the existing things that are there in your mind, established, concrete ideas. It cannot create new dynamic thoughts like imagination can. So it just allows us to play with our memories, mixing, matching them. But we do this intentionally. So if we just take the three terms again and try to understand it in terms of an example, think about a child looking at a tree for the first time. Now, he doesn't know about photosynthesis, he doesn't know about germination of seeds, he doesn't know about xylem and phloem, it doesn't know how things work inside the tree, but it still can see the tree as a tree. The child can even think that the tree is a spirit and the tree is talking to it. And since this is quite common, this is primary imagination, a spontaneous thing. You don't have to exert yourself. Now imagine the same child growing up in a school, learning all about trees, about environmental crisis. And then now when the child looks at a tree, they still look at it as a living thing, but they also have this background knowledge which they associate with the tree. And then they can understand that this tree is not just one tree in front of me. This tree is the tree I have read about in my books. This tree is part of that environment which is under crisis. So when that child has gained knowledge about trees and then looking at the tree, then that one tree becomes more than just one tree. And this is secondary imagination, a more reflective, conscious, deliberate process. So it has more voluntary contribution from your side than primary imagination requires. But it is not completely voluntary. Now imagine a person daydreaming about a tree in his bathroom. That is fancy. He is simply deliberately joining two random things, and there is a problem in the unification. So this idea of a tree inside the bathroom is something not entirely a new idea, although it might sound very unique. Now, if we transfer this knowledge to a poem by Coleridge, which we have discussed in this channel itself, Kubla Khan. It was the first video I had published, and I am really very sentimental about it. I really want you to go and watch it if you haven't. In Kubla Khan, How does primary imagination, secondary imagination, and fancy work? You see, when first the scene is described to us, twice 5 miles of fertile land is encircled, and we have a river, there is Kubla. So we are asked to imagine those things. So that factual description is out of primary imagination. But then when we see Coleridge talking about the symbolic side of it, that is, especially when he says, if I could revive within me her symphony and song, like the music of the woman, the damsel with the dulcimer, is not just one kind of music by one kind of person, is the universal music where humanity meets nature. And this symbolic realization is out of the secondary imagination. And in this poem, where is fancy? Fancy is in that expression like caves of ice, sunless sea. It's nothing very unusual. The idea of a sunless sea is not at all out of the world thing. It's just about the underground drainage that that river has. And he is putting this paradisal river in a different context. So that is the use of fancy. So it's not that a poet only uses secondary imagination or only uses fancy. There's a combination of all these three, which lead to a certain kind of creation, poetic creation. If the secondary imagination is altogether absent, then fancy cannot create what he would have called a proper poem. It would only mean a linguistic exercise or a mental exercise of joining random things. The way in which Dr. Johnson looked at metaphysical poets, disparate elements all are yoked together violently. That is what he said about metaphysical conceits. So these conceits, these are fanciful things. But when you look at the poetry of John Donne, he's not just using conceits, he's bringing them together into a unified whole to create a new kind of idea. So that is secondary imagination. So secondary imagination and fancy, they work very close to each other. It's not that you are only exercising one kind of power. In chapter 14, he finally shifts his focus to lyrical ballads. He begins to talk about the situation in which he and Wordsworth had decided to publish the lyrical ballads. And he says, "It was agreed that my endeavors should be directed to persons and characters supernatural." So it was decided between the two that Coleridge would be focusing on the supernatural, or at least romantic. Romantic as in unrealistic. So he would talk about incidents, his poetry would talk about incidents, characters, which are not found in the common mundane world. But, he adds, yet, so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest and a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination. So the supernatural world is a product of a shadowy imagination. And out of that supernatural world, what would come out? A semblance of reality. People can relate that, yes, this is about a supernatural setup, but it contains elements that match with the real world. Okay? So it's like the stories of the witches and wizards in Harry Potter. If you look at them, you would see that the children have same kinds of jealousies towards each other. The ideas of friendship are very similar to the ones which are seen in the real world. So supernatural world doesn't mean it will be composed entirely of everything that is unreal or unrealistic. Supernatural world may actually project many things which are very much there, essential things, things like human relationships, things like bravery, heroism, courage, envy. All these things may be reflected through supernatural incidents, right? So this is what Coleridge is saying, that my object was to present that, the semblance of truth, that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith. And why is this important to have something in the supernatural realm, something which connects it to the real? Is that when a reader reads something which is supernatural, suppose a ghost story or story about wizards and witches, then the reader knows that this is not real, right? But he suspends, he stops his disbelief. It's like when we go and watch a movie, we see a person dying. We know that the person is not dying, but we feel sad because we have suspended our disbelief that this is all false. So we don't let ourselves remember that we are seeing a virtual thing, right? That is what people do when they go to watch a movie, when they read any storybook. So Coleridge is saying that my object was to bring the supernatural world in such a way that it will give a feeling of the real world, so that people can suspend their disbelief. They can see that this story doesn't matter whether ghosts are real or not. What matters is that the essential conflict, the essential relationship dynamics, those things are very much there in even this supernatural story I'm reading or the poem I'm reading. So let me suspend my disbelief. Okay, so this is how he planned to write his supernatural poems. And what was Wordsworth's contribution going to be? He says, Mr. Wordsworth, on the other hand, was to propose to himself as his object. So Mr. Wordsworth's point of view was he is going to do what? To give the charm of novelty to things of every day. Wordsworth would do exactly the opposite. He would do what? He would take up the real world, the mundane reality. And in that mundane reality, he would bring those flashes of, that kind of thing. So he would transport his readers who will be reading about, say, daffodils and rice fields and mountains and lakes. And amidst those lines, he will put in elements where suddenly that daffodil, that mountain, that lake, that river will become more than what it is. It will become supernature. So Wordsworth will actually make us experience the supernatural through natural. Coleridge would make us experience the natural through supernatural. So their objects were different. And what had Wordsworth said in his preface? And our object was the same. That is not true. Their objects were actually exactly opposite, and that was the entire beauty of it. And then what actually happened? He continues that Wordsworth's object was to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural by awakening the mind's attention to the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and wonders of the world before us. So this was Wordsworth's object. Wordsworth added a preface to the second edition, and this is what Coleridge now talks about. To the second edition, he added a preface of considerable length. So it was longer than he loved, in which, notwithstanding some passages of apparently a contrary import, he was understood to contend for the extension of this style to poetry of all kinds. So this is what Wordsworth did, we remember, right? We have studied preface together, that he was generalizing poetry. Instead of talking about a specific kind of poem, Wordsworth was generalizing poetry. Wordsworth was generalizing poets. Who is a poet? This is a poet. A poetry is always a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. But poetry is not actually possible if you generalize it in that way. So he says, and to reject as vicious and indefensible all phrases and forms of speech that were not included in what he called the language of real life. So Wordsworth did reject every other language as vicious. If it is not the language of real world, real men, man speaking to man, it is not poetry. He said, we know that. Coleridge further says, a poem contains the same elements as prose composition. Wordsworth had said that poetry at its best, it matches prose. Coleridge says, yes, there is similarity between poetry and prose. Both are written in language. It has its structure, very similar. But then there is an essential difference. For Wordsworth, that difference didn't matter much. For Coleridge, it matters a lot. And this difference is meter. He says, the writings of Plato and Jeremy Taylor and Burnet's theory of the earth furnish undeniable proofs that poetry of the highest kind may exist without meter, and even without the contradistinguishing objects of a poem. Yes, you can have poetry without meter, he admits. But a poem of any length neither can be or ought to be all poetry. So, yes, a poem doesn't have to be poetic in all its lines. It can be prosaic. So here he is not differing completely with Wordsworth, but he says that the prosaic elements should be in unity with the poetic elements. You cannot have one very poetic line and then very prosaic lines and there is no connection. That will lead to a lapse in style, which he later identifies in Wordsworth's poems. We'll come to that. And then he defines a poet. Everybody defines a poet. Every poet defines a poet. How does he define so? The poet, described in ideal perfection, Coleridge is playing with words again. The poet is, in short, brings the whole soul of man into activity with the subordination of its faculties to each other according to their relative worth and dignity. What are the faculties of human beings? The sensations that we have, our linguistic faculties, okay, our power of language, our power of music, musicality. So we have all these faculties when we create something or write poetry. Now, this makes up our whole soul. But if I am a poet, I will know how much of my musical faculty should I rely on. What should be given priority? My language or my music or my idea that I'm having in my mind. So this prioritization of faculties is done best by the proper poet, ideal poet. And that creates a unity. My idea will match with the musicality of my writing. Okay. So that is because I am an ideal poet. And he says, he diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends, fuses each into each by that synthetic and magical power, to which I would exclusively appropriate the name of imagination. If I have imagination, I can synthesize my faculties. So it's not just random ideas I'm putting together. I'm involving my power of creation. And poetry is not just about the words a person writes. It's about the arrangement of the words, the rhythm, the meter, and everything. So if a poem is good, how does he define it? Good sense is the body of poetic genius. Good sense means you have to have this good sense about you. All right, sanity about you. That how you are going to put your faculties, put your power in action. So it is the body. It is the main structure of your poem. Fancy, it's drapery. Fancy means the imagery that you are using. Okay, where you are putting some very nice combination of words. Sunless sea, caves of ice. Okay. So that is fancy. It's like decoration. Motion, it's life. So there has to be a movement in a poem. It cannot be just a stagnant piece of decorated language. And imagination, the soul that is everywhere and in each. I know it's vague, but you can still grasp this idea if you simply think about a poem like Kubla Khan or Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And I'm sure you have read at least one Coleridge poem in your life, because otherwise, I don't think how and why you are at all interested in Biographia Literaria. Chapter 15 will be about specific symptoms of poetic power. So he will try to explain now how poetic power works. So what are the things that are there in a human being that would make him a poet? Number one, There has to be a perfect sweetness of the versification, its adaptation to the subject. And he says, the man that hath not music in his soul can indeed never be a genuine poet. But you don't have to be Beethoven. No, you don't. You have to have a sense of musicality. What sounds good? And good doesn't mean pleasant. Good means something which matches with the mood of your poem. So it's like the way in which a movie director thinks about a background score, background music, to enhance the effect of what he is showing on screen. Similarly, when you write a poem, the way the words are arranged, because a poem is supposed to be read aloud, that will create the right kind of mood for that poem or for the idea that is presented in the poem. So you must have a sense of music. A second promise of genius is the choice of subjects very remote from the private interests and circumstances of the writer himself. Sometimes we do see very great autobiographical poems, but Coleridge says that if it's a matter of poetic genius, then you are not talking about your life. You're talking about something very remote from your own life. Kubla Khan, who was he? He was so very far away from Coleridge himself. The ancient mariner, Coleridge, and that's so very different from each other. So when you're capable of bringing to paper the life and experience of someone, something which is not within the immediate reality of your life, then you will have to apply imagination. You cannot simply use fancy here because you do not know about the conditions that happen to those kinds of people or places. Therefore, it requires poetic genius. Until and unless you have that, you cannot write about a person who is remote from you, who is different from you. And then the third thing is, as of higher worth, so doubtless still more characteristic of poetic genius does the imagery become when it molds and colors itself to the circumstances, passion, or character present and foremost in the mind. A poet uses imagery that I have already defined as fancy in some way. If that does not match with the mood, the circumstance, the mindset of the character, if it is a dramatic piece, then that imagery will not be of any use at all. Okay. So when in Shakespeare's Macbeth we have Duncan dying, we also have his horses eat each other. So that image of self-destruction, of betrayal, it becomes a unifying force, connecting the betrayal of Macbeth with the betrayal of the horses with each other, because they are betraying each other, they're eating each other up. So this becomes like an extension of the betrayal of Macbeth. So that is the sign of a poetic genius. And then finally he says, no man was ever yet a great poet without being at the same time a profound philosopher. So you have to be a philosopher, a thinking person. So these four are the essential features of a poet according to Coleridge. And in chapter 16, he contrasts the poetry of the 15th and 16th centuries with that of his own time. And he says that, no, the age-old time was a good one where we had these kinds of unities, and now people are not utilizing their potential because his contemporary poets were focusing more on creating these striking imagery, extraordinary individualistic images, which are at odds with the idea of unity that he has. Chapter 17 brings us back to Wordsworth, and first he talks about the limited applicability of Wordsworth's language theory, that poetry is man speaking to men, that idea. He says that Wordsworth's idea is applicable only to a certain kind of poems. Wordsworth had generalized poetry. That is not possible. He says, my objection is first that in any sense this rule is applicable only to certain classes of poetry. Secondly, that even to these classes it is not applicable except in such a sense as hath never been by anyone been denied or doubted. So it's not like you can write poetry only by using language of the common man. You can use it sparingly, you can use it partially, and not even in all kinds of poetry. If the poem's mood is an elevated one, how can you write using common man's language? You will have to have a different kind of vocabulary for it. Then he talks about how Wordsworth defines rural life in poetry. Wordsworth had idealized the rural world. He had said that rural world is the ideal world. People in the villages, they are ideal people. They have ideal emotions, okay, and they are not corrupted by urbanity. What does Coleridge say? He says, the poet informs his reader that he had generally chosen low and rustic life, but not as low and rustic, or in order to repeat that pleasure of doubtful moral effect which people of elevated rank and of superior refinement oftentimes derive from a happy imitation of the rude, unpolished manners and discourse of their inferiors. So, I know it's complicated. Let's just look at the important words in this statement. He says that persons of elevated rank, that is, people who belong to the urban societies, the sophisticated people, what do? They happily imitate some things of the rude, unpolished people. It's like you go for this eco-village resort where you want to live in the mud house. It's an artificial setup. Why do you do it? Because you gain some kind of a doubtful moral effect. It's like you are trying to live a life which you do not live normally, but which you have idealized as the good life, morally good life, right? But this is all your thinking. It is not true. People are good in cities, people are good in villages. People are bad in cities, people are bad in villages. So this is what Coleridge says, that Wordsworth is not giving us rustic life. He is trying to give us his idea of rustic life. Okay. So he has certain idea about the people of the villages that he is giving. So you are delivered a village resort, not a village. This is what Coleridge says. And he also says that there are limitations in the rustic's language. I deny that the words and combination of words derived from the objects with which the rustic is familiar, whether with distinct or confused knowledge, can be justly said to form the best part of language. Rustic language is not the best part of language. People have studied language, and sophistication does not mean bad language. So he completely says that what was Wordsworth thinking? And he rather says the best part of human language, properly so called, is derived from reflection on the acts of the mind itself. It is formed by voluntary appropriation of fixed symbols to internal acts. So using language is not always a spontaneous thing. It involves a voluntary action on your part. So he hits at Wordsworth's idealization of rural life. He hits at the way in which Wordsworth is talking about language as a spontaneous thing. And then he says, what is the difference between the poetic representation and the reality? He continues, I adopt with full faith the principle of Aristotle that poetry as poetry is essentially ideal. So you cannot say I'll present real because you are deciding to do the ideal. Like you want to paint a picture, okay, it will always be not real because you are painting it. So you are putting a creative force into effect. So how can you say I'm putting reality there? That it avoids and excludes all accident, that its apparent individualities of rank, character, occupation must be representative of a class. So he does not believe in just letting go of your lines and your words, just following blindly the diction of the common man. That is not poetry for Coleridge. And in chapter 8, he had already focused on meter. He had said, there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. Such is Mr. Wordsworth's assertion. Now, prose itself, at least in all argumentative and consecutive works, differs and ought to differ from the language of conversation. That is, prose, when you write it, is also different from the way you talk. Like, for instance, if I am to write an article on Biographia Literaria, would I be writing down whatever I've said today? Literally, no. It will be different from the way I'm talking. And if I'm talking to a friend, that will be even more different from the way I'm talking now in this video. Because every language is dependent on the setup, on the context in which it is written. So how can you say the language of prose, the language of poetry are all similar, and they're all very similar to the language of the common man speaking to another man? Not possible. In chapter 22, he makes a thorough post-mortem of Wordsworth's poems. And he says, the first characteristic, though only occasional defect, which I appeared to myself to find in these poems, he's talking about the poems by Wordsworth in Lyrical Ballads, is the inconstancy of the style. Now, this is what I've already explained, that in Wordsworth we have this very lofty statement and suddenly there's a drop in style. So that is what he's referring to as inconstancy of style. The second defect I can generalize with tolerable accuracy if the reader will pardon an uncouth and new coin word. He's again using a new word here. So he's saying that the second defect is not seldom a matter of factness in certain poems. That means Wordsworth focuses on matter of factness. He focuses too much on biographical details. For instance, he creates this character and then talks about the parents, the house, the background in such meticulous detail that it is so unnecessary according to Coleridge. So that is his second objection. Third is an undue predilection for the dramatic form in certain poems from which one or other of two evils result. Sometimes Wordsworth uses dramatic lines, dramatic form. What happens is that in a dramatic form, what do we expect? We expect the speakers to have their own language and the narrator to have a different kind of a language. But in Wordsworth, Coleridge says the narrator, the characters, all of them have same kind of diction. And he says, it presents a species of ventriloquism where two are represented as talking, while in truth one man only speaks. So there is no change in tone, no change in diction between the narratorial lines and the dramatic lines. So it is not at all faithfully represented. So that is another objection. The fourth class of defects is closely connected with the former. Now, when you have this monotony of diction, what happens is occasional prolixity, repetition, and an eddying instead of progression of thought. So, in Wordsworth, he finds that he says the same thing over and over again. There is no progression of thought. And this is something I have even talked about when we were talking about Tintern Abbey. That there is progression, but it's like kind of, he stretches things too far. Again, in Immortality Ode, he's repeating. And many people, many critics hold this view that Wordsworth had not aged well. He should have stopped writing because he wrote the same thing over again. So what was the point of going on to the same thing? Fifth and last, thoughts and images too great for the subject. This is an approximation to what might be called a mental bombast, as distinguished from verbal. So what is happening is that, suppose an occasion, a circumstance is not that big deal, but Wordsworth will make such a huge image about it that you will anticipate something great is about to happen and nothing happens. That is Wordsworth for you. So this is how he's criticizing Wordsworth. But after all, he was a friend. And he was not a hater of Wordsworth. In fact, soon after he writes these critical things, I don't know, he must have felt bad, or he really wanted to give the other side too, because he was an objective critic. He gives a set of praises. First, he says, an austere purity of language, both grammatically and logically. In short, a perfect appropriateness of the words to the meaning. Wordsworth was amazing with his vocabulary, and he knew how to precisely use words. And Coleridge really loved that about him. Okay, so he was very good with vocabulary. The second characteristic excellence of Mr. Wordsworth's work is the weight and sanity of the thoughts and sentiments, won not from books, but from the poet's own meditative observation. So the sincerity in Wordsworth was something praiseworthy. He did not obtain his knowledge from bookish information, but from his intimacy with the natural world, with the thinking mind. And earlier Coleridge had said that in order to be a poet, you have to be a philosopher. So far as philosophy is concerned, Wordsworth was a thinking man. We know about his pantheistic philosophy, we know about his environmentalist mindset. So those are the things which are praised by Coleridge. And he goes on to say the third, and wherein he soars far above Daniel. Daniel was an Elizabethan poet whom Coleridge really praised. Although Daniel is not very popular, but Coleridge had a high regard for him. And he says that Wordsworth goes even beyond Daniel, where the sinewy strength and originality of single lines and paragraphs, the way in which Wordsworth handles his diction, his lines, he creates this single lines and paragraphs which you would love to memorize and use as quotes, right? Especially the line like, nature never did betray the heart that loved her. Line from Tintern Abbey. What a wonderful line. Like, you take it out of the context, you put it anywhere, even you can, write that line down, print it out, get it framed, put it in your library or even bedroom. The things that we love to post on Facebook with a picture and a caption. So Wordsworth is a great caption writer. I don't know if this is a praise or what. Single paragraph or single line means Wordsworth doesn't have to write a good poem to give you a good line. This means his lines are not always connected with the rest of the poem, because then one line would not come out as a great line, right? So he's talking about the beauty of diction. Fourth, the perfect truth of nature. Now, this is one thing that we all admit, that yes, if you take everything away from Wordsworth, you cannot take away the fact that he was a nature lover. He was rejuvenated by nature. There was nothing insincere in that. And this is something Coleridge understood, appreciated. And he says, the truth of nature in his images and descriptions as taken immediately from nature. So Wordsworth did not read a book on nature. He went to nature, derived it firsthand. And finally, a meditative pathos, a union of deep and subtle thought with sensibility, a sympathy with man as man. So the idea of, that common shared humanity, that empathy, when he's looking at the solitary reaper, he is feeling one with the reaper, although he doesn't know the language of the reaper. When he is looking at the daffodils remain in his mind and provide him with restorative peace. When he is standing with Dorothy beside the river Wye in Tintern Abbey, he is sharing a kind of a shared humanity with her, where he can connect with her on some universal level. That is something really great in Wordsworth, and that's why Wordsworth appeals to us even now. He has some kind of a strange connection with, 21st century people as well. Last and preeminently, and this is, let me tell you, this is like a love letter to Wordsworth, the way he gives this point. He says, in the play of fancy, when it comes to fancy, that is, putting these eye-catching images and all those things, Wordsworth, to my feelings, is not always graceful and sometimes recondite. So he doesn't give credit to Wordsworth when it comes to fancy, because in Wordsworth's poems, you don't have very remarkable, startling imagery like you have in Coleridge, for instance. But The likeness is occasionally too strange, demands too peculiar a point of view, and he criticizes Wordsworth's use of fancy. Indeed, his fancy seldom displays itself as mere and unmodified fancy. So, Wordsworth's fanciful imagery or whatever is very unrealistic. It's not something that Coleridge approves of. But in imaginative power, he stands nearest of all modern writers to Shakespeare and Milton. So he is closest to Shakespeare and Milton than any other writer of Coleridge's time. Now that's a compliment. That he might not be able to use fancy much, but his imagination is amazing. Where is the difference? Take, for instance, a poem like The Stolen Boat. You remember, maybe you have read that poem. There, Wordsworth, it's part of his prelude. He's a young child and he has managed to take a boat away. He's sailing towards a mountain. Suddenly the shape of the mountains, they loom large on him, and he, senses a spirit, and he feels frightened. And the terror of that child is occasioned not by any voluntary act of fancy, but imagining the ideal, supreme existence of nature and supernature all together in that dark mountain. So that is secondary imagination, where it started off with a willing action, looking at the mountain. But at one point, remember that leaping, at one point, you lose control and your mind works involuntarily to create that second degree of infinite I am in front of you. That is an aha moment. And Wordsworth could create that with common natural objects. Think about the Lucy poems. The way in which the idea of Lucy's death as something of a universal mourning is introduced to us. So Wordsworth must have seen these lines, and knowing Wordsworth as I feel he was, he must have been really, really moved by the compliment here. Yes, the two friends did reconcile, although the old spark never came back. The cracked mirror is always cracked, But still, there was possibly some meeting ground. And this book, Biographia Literaria, in being so scattered, shows the scattered mind of Coleridge too. And the fact that he was really struggling to unify it all. He was an opium addict, and for an opium addict, it is understandable that creative efforts begin on a voluntary level. But suppose you have consumed opium, there will be a moment when you lose yourself. So it is easier for him to conceive of creative process as transitioning from that voluntary decision that, look, I'm going to write a poem, to that involuntary giving up. That is difficult for us to grasp at times. But again, think of Kubla Khan. He was dreaming. He got up. He decided to write. So when he started to write, then it was only the factual details he was giving us, part of his primary imagination. Then that visitor came, there was interruption. He comes back, he tries to struggle with some fanciful expressions, and then suddenly he gets to where we have the line describing the madman, the frenzied poet with flashing eyes and floating hair. That frenzied poet is under the spell of the secondary imagination. And you know what happens when somebody is under a frenzy? It's not voluntary, it's not completely involuntary. And it's in that combined moment, or rather the intermediate moment or intermediate power, that Coleridge attributes to the power of creativity. I'm not very sure if I have explained much of the topics, but I've tried to cover as much as possible. And if you are a student of literature, I think we have covered most of the relevant portions. We have covered Coleridge's definition of imagination, fancy. We have talked about willing suspension of disbelief. We have talked about his idea of poetry. We have talked about his objections to Wordsworth and his praise of Wordsworth as well. We have also touched upon the ideas of associationism and contemporary philosophy too in a very simplistic manner. That is all for today. I hope to see you all in our next video. Write in the comments what you think about this video and about any other topic you want us to cover. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Stay happy, stay subscribed. Bye bye.